I stole the pastry because I was hungry, not because I was a thief. Funny how life never bothers explaining the difference before it changes everything. The buttery smell drifted through the little bakery every morning before sunrise, wrapping around the neighborhood like a warm blanket that most people barely noticed anymore. I noticed it every single day. It floated across the street while I unlocked the flower shop where I worked part-time, reminding me that breakfast had become a luxury after Mom's medical bills swallowed every spare dollar I earned. That Tuesday, I checked my wallet 3 times, hoping money might magically appear if I looked hard enough. 37 cents. That was all I had. Not enough for coffee. Definitely not enough for the raspberry cream pastry displayed beneath the glass case, golden, flaky, and still warm from the oven. I told myself to walk away. I really did. But my stomach growled loud enough that an elderly customer glanced at me with a sympathetic smile, and embarrassment burned hotter than hunger. The young cashier disappeared into the kitchen to help another employee. Nobody seemed to notice me standing alone beside the display. My hand moved before my brain caught up. I slipped the pastry into the pocket of my oversized cardigan, whispered a shaky apology to nobody in particular, and headed toward the door with my heart pounding so hard I could hear over the soft jazz playing through the speakers. 3 more steps, and I would have been outside. Then a calm voice stopped me cold. "You forgot to pay for my breakfast." I froze with my hand still wrapped around the door handle. Slowly, I turned around. The man standing near the corner table looked completely out of place inside the cozy little bakery. His charcoal suit fit like it had been tailored that morning. His silver watch caught the sunlight spilling through the front windows. Dark hair, pale skin, steady blue eyes, and an expression so unreadable it almost felt carved from stone. Every employee had gone silent. One baker lowered the tray he was carrying. Even the espresso machine seemed louder than anyone breathing. I had never seen him before, but somehow everyone else already knew exactly who he was. Heat rushed into my face as I reached into my pocket and placed the untouched pastry on the nearest table with trembling hands. I'm sorry," I whispered. "I only had 37 cents. His eyes rested on me for what felt like forever before they shifted to the pastry. Then, to my complete confusion, the corner of his mouth moved almost imperceptibly. "No," he said quietly. "Finish it." For a second, I wondered if I had imagined those words. Finish it. Nobody had ever looked at me after catching me doing something embarrassing with that much calm. I blinked twice, convinced there had to be a catch. "I cannot," I said, my voice barely louder than a whisper. "I already caused enough trouble." The man leaned back in his chair and folded his hands as though he had all the time in the world. "You looked hungrier than guilty." One of the bakers nearly dropped a tray of croissants. The cashier stared at him with wide eyes before quickly pretending to organize napkins that were already perfectly stacked. The entire bakery felt frozen except for the ticking clock above the pastry case. My cheeks burned so badly I thought I might melt into the hardwood floor. "Please," I said. "I can come back tomorrow. I get paid on Friday. I will buy 2 pastries instead of 1. He studied me without interrupting. His blue eyes did not carry judgment. They simply noticed everything. My worn sneakers. The loose cardigan with a tiny hole near the sleeve. The dark circles beneath my eyes. The flower shop apron sticking out of my canvas tote bag. Finally, he nodded toward the empty chair across from him. "Sit." Every sensible thought in my head screamed that I should run. Instead, my feet betrayed me. I sat carefully on the edge of the chair, clutching the warm pastry with both hands like it might disappear. Before I could speak again, the owner hurried out from the kitchen, wiping flour from his hands. "Good morning, Mr. Moretti," he said nervously. "Would you like your usual?" The man answered without taking his eyes off me. 2 coffees. Another raspberry pastry. Fresh. The owner nodded so quickly that he almost lost his glasses before disappearing again. My heart skipped. Moretti. I had heard that name before. People in the neighborhood never said it loudly. They lowered their voices first. Suddenly, every strange reaction in the bakery made sense, and my stomach tightened for an entirely different reason. I glanced toward the door, measuring the distance. He noticed. "If you wanted to leave," he said evenly, "you would have already done it." I looked down at the pastry in my hands. I was only trying to make it through today. My words escaped before I could stop them. Silence settled between us. Then the fresh pastry arrived, filling the air with butter and warm raspberry filling. He pushed the new plate toward me instead of the one I had hidden in my pocket. Eat the fresh one, he said. Nobody deserves stale guilt when warm kindness is still available. I looked at him in complete disbelief. My hands trembled as I broke off the first flaky bite, and before I could catch it, a shower of crumbs landed directly across the front of his perfectly tailored charcoal suit. The tiny flakes of pastry scattered across his expensive suit like fresh snow, and my heart nearly stopped. Oh no! I jumped to my feet so quickly that my chair scraped loudly across the floor. I am so sorry. Without thinking, I reached for a stack of napkins and immediately made everything worse by knocking one of the coffee cups sideways. The cup tipped just enough to send a few drops onto the polished wooden table. I froze again. Somewhere behind the counter, somebody gasped. I wanted the floor to open beneath me. I promise I am not always this much of a disaster, I blurted out, although the sentence sounded ridiculous the moment it left my mouth. Adrian Moretti looked down at the crumbs covering the front of his jacket. His expression remained perfectly calm. I waited for disappointment, frustration, or at least a sigh. Instead, he picked a single flaky crumb from his sleeve and examined it, as though it were the most interesting thing he had seen all morning. Then something extraordinary happened. The corner of his mouth lifted. It was small, barely noticeable, but it was unmistakably a smile. One of the bakers stopped kneading dough. The owner nearly dropped an entire tray into the display case. Nobody in the bakery seemed to believe what they were seeing. Adrian brushed the remaining crumbs onto the table with slow, careful movements. It appears my suit enjoyed breakfast before I did. I stared at him, unsure whether he was joking. Then, completely against my own will, a nervous laugh escaped my lips. I covered my mouth immediately. I should not have laughed. Why not? He asked. Because I made a mess. You made a memory, he replied. His answer lingered in the warm air between us. I had spent years apologizing for taking up too much space, laughing too loudly, dropping things, bumping into shelves, and never fitting the graceful image everyone seemed to expect. Yet this stranger looked at every awkward moment as though it belonged in a story instead of a list of mistakes. The owner cautiously approached our table carrying a clean towel. Sir, I can have your jacket professionally cleaned within the hour. Adrian shook his head. No. The owner blinked. No. Adrian glanced toward me before answering. Leave it exactly as it is. Confusion spread across every face in the bakery except mine. I was too busy wondering why someone with his reputation seemed more interested in protecting my dignity than his designer suit. As I finished the last bite of the pastry, sunlight spilled through the front windows, warming the table between us. Adrian checked the elegant watch on his wrist, stood without rushing, and placed enough cash beside the receipt to pay for every pastry in the display case. Before walking toward the door, he looked back at me with the same unreadable blue eyes. Emily, he said quietly, somehow already knowing my name. Tomorrow morning, try asking instead of stealing. You might be surprised by the answer. The bell above the bakery door chimed softly behind Adrian as he disappeared into the cool morning air, but I could not bring myself to move. It felt as though the entire room had been holding its breath until the moment he left. The owner slowly exhaled first. Then one of the bakers laughed under his breath in complete disbelief. I have worked here for 12 years, he murmured while shaking his head. I have never seen him smile. Every pair of eyes turned toward me. I looked behind my shoulder, convinced they had to be staring at someone else. Me? I asked quietly. The cashier nodded so enthusiastically that her ponytail bounced. You covered his suit with pastry crumbs, almost spilled his coffee, admitted you tried to steal breakfast, and somehow you walked out with free food instead of getting thrown out. I looked down at the empty plate in front of me. That does sound strange when you say it like that. A few people laughed, and the heavy silence that had filled the bakery all morning finally melted away. The owner folded the receipt Adrian had signed and slipped it carefully into the register as though it were something valuable. Miss Carter, he said, I believe you forgot something. He placed a small white bakery box on the counter. He paid for this before he left. I blinked in confusion, but I already ate. Apparently he knew that would not last very long. The warm scent of fresh raspberry pastry drifted from the box as I carefully lifted the lid. Inside rested another pastry, perfectly golden, along with a handwritten note in neat, confident lettering. Eat before you decide the world has forgotten your kindness. There was no signature. There did not need to be one. I closed the box gently, my chest feeling unexpectedly heavy. Nobody had ever noticed how often I pretended not to be hungry. Not my coworkers. Not my landlord. Not even some of my closest friends. Somehow a man who had spoken fewer than 50 words to me had seen straight through every smile I had practiced over the past 3 years. I thanked the owner, tucked the little box into my tote bag, and hurried across the street toward the flower shop. The morning rush had already begun, and buckets filled with roses, lilies, and sunflowers lined the sidewalk. My manager waved me inside before I was even halfway to the door. "Emily," she called with a grin. "You are 5 minutes late." I laughed awkwardly. I know. It has been a very unusual morning. I believed the strange encounter was already over. I had no way of knowing that across the street, behind the tinted window of a black luxury sedan waiting quietly at the curb, a pair of calm blue eyes watched me unlock the flower shop with the faintest trace of another impossible smile. The rest of the day refused to feel ordinary. Every bouquet I wrapped, every ribbon I tied, every customer I greeted, my thoughts drifted back across the street to the bakery and the impossible man who had smiled over a jacket covered in pastry crumbs. By late afternoon, my feet ached, my shoulders felt heavy, and I still had 2 more hours before I could visit Mom at the rehabilitation center. Life had become a careful balancing act of paychecks, bus schedules, discount grocery stores, and pretending everything was under control. As I locked the flower shop that evening, my manager called after me. "Emily, somebody already paid for tomorrow's flower delivery to St. Mary's Children's Shelter." I stopped in surprise. That cannot be right. I always donate those arrangements myself. She checked the invoice again before shrugging. "Paid in full this morning. Anonymous." I smiled to myself, assuming one of our regular customers had decided to help. Across town, however, Adrian Moretti sat inside a quiet office overlooking the city skyline, while a single folder rested on the polished desk before him. He had not asked for much, only a name. Yet the folder told a far bigger story than he expected. Emily Carter, 26 years old, part-time florist, weekend assistant at a community center, primary caregiver for her mother after a serious illness. No criminal record, no unpaid luxuries, no vacations, no expensive habits. Every extra dollar she earned quietly disappeared into medical expenses, rent, and donations to a neighborhood children's shelter. Adrian closed the folder without another word. One of his trusted associates waited patiently nearby. "Sir." Adrian remained silent for several moments before asking a question that surprised even himself. "How many mornings has she skipped breakfast?" The associate hesitated. "According to the cafe owner next door, almost every weekday for the past 8 months." Adrian slowly looked toward the city lights outside his window. "She stole 1 pastry." His associate nodded carefully. Adrian continued in the same calm voice. "After denying herself hundreds." The room fell silent again. Finally, Adrian stood, slipped on his charcoal jacket, and reached into the inside pocket. A tiny pastry crumb still clung to the fabric despite the careful brushing from earlier that morning. Instead of removing it, he smiled almost to himself. "Leave it." The associate looked puzzled but said nothing. Meanwhile, I arrived at Mom's room carrying fresh daisies that had not sold during the day. She smiled the moment she saw them. "Those flowers always make the room brighter," she whispered. I kissed her forehead and arranged them beside the window. I never noticed the elegant black sedan parked quietly across the street from the rehabilitation center, nor the man inside who remained only long enough to make certain I had safely walked through the front entrance before asking his driver to continue on. 3 mornings passed before I saw him again. By then, I had almost convinced myself the bakery had been nothing more than a strange, beautiful interruption in an otherwise predictable life. I returned to my routine of opening the flower shop before sunrise, delivering arrangements across the neighborhood, and stretching every dollar as far as it could possibly go. On Thursday afternoon, my manager handed me a small envelope with my name written neatly across the front. "A customer asked me to give you this," she said. Inside was a simple gift card to the bakery across the street. No note, no signature, just enough to cover breakfast for several weeks. I looked around through the shop window, hoping to catch whoever had left it, but the sidewalk was crowded with strangers carrying coffee cups and briefcases. I slipped the card back into the envelope and smiled despite myself. That evening, after visiting Mom, I stopped by the neighborhood children's shelter carrying 2 boxes of day-old pastries the bakery had donated. The children rushed toward the boxes with excited laughter, and within seconds, every pastry had disappeared into grateful little hands. Watching them laugh filled something inside me that exhaustion never seemed able to reach. I never noticed the black sedan parked quietly across the street until it slowly pulled away after the last child waved goodbye. Inside the car, Adrian watched through the window without saying a word. His driver glanced into the rearview mirror. "Sir, that is the 3rd evening this week." Adrian continued looking toward the shelter. "Does she always come here?" "According to the information we gathered, every Thursday after visiting her mother." Adrian nodded once. "And the pastries?" "She never keeps them for herself." Silence settled over the car. Finally, Adrian spoke so quietly that it almost disappeared beneath the hum of the engine. "She stole because she was hungry. She gives because she remembers what hunger feels like." The driver offered no reply. Some observations deserved silence. The following morning, I finally decided to use the bakery gift card. As I stepped inside, the familiar scent of butter and fresh raspberries wrapped around me again. The owner greeted me with a warm smile before I could even reach the counter. "Good morning, Emily. Your usual is already waiting." I blinked in confusion. "My usual?" He pointed toward the corner table. There sat a warm raspberry pastry beside a fresh cup of coffee, exactly the way it had been that unforgettable morning. My heart skipped as I slowly turned toward the window. Adrian Moretti stood outside on the sidewalk, speaking quietly with an elderly man who appeared to be struggling with several heavy grocery bags. Without hesitation, Adrian accepted 2 of the bags, walked the man all the way across the crosswalk, and waited until he reached the opposite curb safely before returning to his waiting car. He never looked inside the bakery. He never waited for thanks. By the time I reached the window, the black sedan had already disappeared into the morning traffic, leaving only the untouched coffee, the warm pastry, and a question that refused to leave my heart. Who was the real Adrian Moretti? Questions have a strange way of following you home. They sit beside you on the bus, linger while you fold laundry, and whisper in the quiet moments when the world finally slows down. Mine had blue eyes and an impossible smile that nobody else seemed to believe existed. A week passed without seeing Adrian again, yet little things kept appearing around me like pieces of a puzzle I never meant to solve. The rehabilitation center called to tell me that an anonymous donor had covered another month of Mom's physical therapy. The children's shelter suddenly received fresh flowers every Thursday instead of leftover arrangements. Even the bakery owner quietly slipped an extra pastry into my bag whenever I stopped by after work. Every time I tried to thank someone, they simply smiled and claimed they were following instructions. Nobody would tell me whose. On Saturday afternoon, the neighborhood hosted its annual street market. Families filled the sidewalks. Musicians played cheerful songs near the fountain, and children darted between colorful booths with painted faces and sticky fingers. I volunteered at the flower stand, helping little kids build tiny bouquets for their parents. It was the kind of simple happiness money could never buy. While tying a ribbon around a handful of daisies, I glanced across the crowd and saw him standing near a coffee cart. Adrian wore a dark navy coat instead of one of his expensive suits, making him look almost ordinary if someone ignored the quiet respect people naturally gave him. He was speaking with an elderly veteran in a wheelchair, listening far more than he talked. When the conversation ended, Adrian shook the man's hand with genuine warmth before walking away without waiting for recognition. I watched him until he disappeared behind a row of market tents. "You know him?" my manager asked softly beside me. I hesitated before answering. "I'm not sure that I do." She smiled knowingly. "Most people think they know him because they have heard stories. Very few have actually looked." Her words stayed with me long after the market closed. As the sun dipped below the buildings, I packed the last flowers into empty buckets and started the walk toward the bus stop. Halfway there, a little girl tugged gently on my sleeve. She could not have been older than 7. "Miss," she said with a bright smile, "the nice man said this belongs to you." She handed me a small paper bag before skipping back toward her parents. Inside rested a still warm raspberry pastry and a folded note written in the same careful handwriting I recognized immediately. "You finally asked the right question. Keep looking with your own eyes, not someone else's." I looked up instinctively, searching the crowded street. But all I found was the fading glow of evening lights and the lingering feeling that somewhere nearby, Adrian Moretti had quietly walked away once again before I ever had the chance to say thank you. The note stayed folded inside my wallet for days, its edges growing softer each time I reached for it. Keep looking with your own eyes, not someone else's. I repeated those words more often than I cared to admit. They followed me through long shifts at the flower shop, quiet evenings beside Mom's hospital bed, and peaceful Thursday afternoons at the children's shelter. The more I paid attention, the more impossible it became to ignore what everyone else seemed determined to overlook. Adrian never arrived with cameras. He never waited for applause. He simply appeared, solved a problem nobody else had noticed, and disappeared before gratitude could catch up with him. One rainy afternoon, I watched him kneel beneath the awning of a small bookstore, helping a nervous little boy gather dozens of comic books that had spilled across the wet sidewalk. He smiled patiently while the child apologized over and over, then handed him the last comic with a gentle nod before walking away as though nothing remarkable had happened. Nobody recognized him except me. Later that same evening, I found myself standing outside the bakery again. The owner greeted me with a knowing smile before quietly placing a raspberry pastry into a small paper box. "He already paid," he said. I laughed softly and shook my head. "Does he always know when I am coming?" The owner shrugged. "No. He only remembers the people who matter to him." His answer left me speechless. I stepped outside just as a familiar black sedan rolled slowly to the curb. The rear window lowered halfway, and for the first time since that unforgettable morning, Adrian looked directly at me. "Have you eaten today?" he asked. I could not help smiling. "Yes." He studied my face for a moment. "You answered faster this time." I laughed, and the sound surprised both of us. "Because it is true." He seemed quietly relieved. Rain tapped gently against the roof of the car while the city hurried around us. "Thank you," I said at last. "For my mother. For the shelter. For pretending none of it was your doing." Adrian looked toward the windshield instead of accepting the gratitude. People deserve dignity more than they deserve credit. Those words settled deep inside me. I took one careful step closer to the car. "Everyone tells stories about you," I admitted. "But none of them sound like the man I keep meeting." He looked back at me with calm blue eyes that no longer seemed distant. "Stories are usually written by people standing far away." Before I could answer, the traffic light turned green. The driver eased the car forward, but Adrian paused just long enough to offer the smallest smile. "Keep looking, Emily." As the sedan disappeared into the rain, I realized something had quietly changed between us. I was no longer trying to understand the city's most mysterious man. I was simply beginning to know Adrian. Some people believe destiny arrives with fireworks. Mine arrived wrapped in brown paper, filled with raspberries and butter, because one small act of kindness can quietly rewrite an entire life. Almost a year passed before I truly understood what that morning inside the bakery had started. Mom walked without assistance for the first time since her illness. The children's shelter expanded its reading room after receiving several anonymous donations. The flower shop grew busier than ever, and for the first time in years, I no longer counted every dollar before buying groceries. Life still had difficult days, but hope had finally become stronger than fear. On the first warm morning of spring, I crossed the street to the bakery carrying a small white box of my own. The owner smiled the moment he saw me. "He is already here," he whispered. I found Adrian sitting at the same corner table where everything had begun. Sunlight spilled across the wooden floor, warming the quiet room exactly as it had months before. He looked up as I approached, and this time I smiled first. Without saying a word, I placed the box in front of him. "What is this?" he asked. "Breakfast," I answered, paid for honestly. A quiet laugh escaped him as he opened the lid. Inside rested a raspberry pastry from the very same bakery. Perfectly golden, perfectly ordinary. Yet somehow it carried the weight of every impossible moment that had followed our first meeting. Adrian looked from the pastry to me with those familiar blue eyes that no longer seemed distant. "You remembered." "I never forgot," I admitted. "Not because of the pastry." I paused before finishing the thought. "Because that was the first day someone saw me instead of judging me." For several seconds, neither of us spoke. We simply shared the peaceful silence that only honest people seem able to understand. Finally, Adrian broke the pastry in half and offered me one piece. "Then we should share it this time." I accepted with a smile, and as I reached for it, a few flaky crumbs landed on the front of his jacket once again. We looked at the crumbs. Then we looked at each other. Adrian laughed, openly this time, the kind of genuine laugh that reached his eyes and filled the entire bakery with warmth. Every employee stopped working just long enough to smile with him. Nobody seemed surprised anymore. It had become part of who he was. I realized then that I had never changed the most powerful man in the city. I had simply met the kind-hearted man who had been hiding beneath everyone else's assumptions. Sometimes people ask me how our story began. They expect something dramatic, something extraordinary. I simply smile and tell them that the sweetest chapters of life often begin with an empty wallet, a warm pastry, and a stranger who chooses compassion when judgment would have been much easier.